Well, as part of our end-of-century programme, we now look at entertainment. David Fordy, you came to Colchester in 1963. What sort of theatre did you find in town?
Something that I was amazed to have survived, because in those days it was at the Albert Hall and Art Gallery, which is now the Co-op Bank, and it was converted like many reps in those days, but it was so run down, I couldn't believe it. And it was very dispiriting, I remember, when I first came. There was an audience of about 30-something, an auditorium seating 368. And I remember very clearly, having been appointed as boss man, you know, that's what I was then. And then I went to the performance that night when I arrived, and I invited the actors and stage staff to a drink afterwards. And they came up in silence, and they all drank their drink and went away, said thank you, and didn't say a word. It was a most chilling experience. The next morning, they were all queued up on the stairs. None of them had got a contract. Most of them said they weren't being paid what they were promised. So I said I'd do what I could, and I went down to see the manager, Mary Rollings, and said, what are we going to do? And she opened the desk drawer, which was full of buff envelopes. I said, what are those? She said, they're bills, and they're all unopened. I said, unpaid bills? Yes, she said, there's no money to pay them. There's no money in the bank to pay the actors at the end of the week. And I went upstairs to June Cullum, as she was then, and I said, can I see the budget, please? She said, what budget? I said, well, you must be working to an annual budget. Oh, no, she said, Bob Digby, that's who it was, my predecessor, he used to carry that in his head. So I went on from there.
Was it a weekly rep, a fortnightly rep? What sort of shows were being put on?
It had been, until the year before, a weekly rep. But to qualify for Arts Council grant, it had to change to a fortnightly change of programme to bring the standards up a bit. And what happened was, there was a massive loss of audience, because the regulars that used to go every Wednesday, every Tuesday, every Thursday, what it was, found something to do with the other Tuesday or Wednesday, and then they found what to do with all the Wednesdays. And so the percentage of attendance went down like a stone. And you've got to remember that about that time, theatres were closing down in 1950s, early 1960s. It was a very bad time for the theatre.
What sort of plays? Were they popular plays? Were they farces? Were they Shakespeare? What sort of plays were the Colchester people enjoying at that time?
The astonishing thing was that the repertoire was very much wider than is possible nowadays. For this reason, I think, that there was a permanent company of actors and actresses. And, of course, if you're at a permanent company, you don't get paid while you're rehearsing. And it meant that you can afford to keep a larger company going. And the breadth of repertoire, up till about that time, was quite astonishing at what they were able to do. Far wider repertoire than nowadays, because if you did something adventurous and you dropped a bit, you could probably pick up the next two shows if they were popular shows, and there were more popular shows around in those days. You could pick up the pieces. Nowadays, the loss you make on one show, it'll take you a year or two to pick it up again. And there aren't those well-known plays coming off from London that everybody seemed to know about in those days. Nowadays, people don't seem to know anything very much about plays. All they know about is the names of television personalities. And if you put on a play nowadays with a television personality on, you're packed out. If you don't, you're not.
Mm. What was the cycle, David, then, of rehearsals and then going into a production? I mean, you were casting people very early on, were you, for the fortnightly rep?
Permanent company, very largely. You had people extra if you're going to have a larger cast play, you see. The pattern in those days for fortnightly rep, you opened on a Monday after a hell of a weekend getting everything ready, and the Tuesday morning you met together and you started rehearsals for the next one. And so you're always rehearsing during the day and playing during the evening. You were supposed to be able to do twice as well in the fortnight as you were in a week. In fact, you didn't. You tried to go too deeply into the play, and whereas the old weekly rep formula, as I remember it, was astonishingly efficient and could be surprisingly good in its results, as well as being surprisingly awful sometimes, On the whole, fortnightly was the worst kind of period. 3 weeks was very much better. You tried to do too much in the time, and it didn't work as well as it should have done.
Can we talk now about the building itself? I remember a splendid balcony with probably armchairs upstairs, but behind the scenes, what was it like behind the stage and under the stage?
No, there were clapped out cinema seats throughout. And backstage was unbelievable. Well, to begin with, the stage, the whole of the front of the stage was built out over trestles. And it meant that if you did a musical, as the second show after pantomime, when I arrived, there was a boyfriend, you had to send somebody underneath because all the trestle bits marched along because they weren't fixed. And it would have meant the whole thing would have gone up like that. And clouds of dust came out. And backstage, there was a manager's office underground with no ventilation, no natural light. There were sort of horse boxes along underneath, again with no ventilation, no natural light. The whole place was permeated by a smell compounded of three things. First of all, the urinals, which were public because all the bus drivers used them, and they couldn't be kept clean. Second one was the overlay of extremely strong disinfectant that Dawn and Fred used to put to try and mask it. The third was coffee grounds. And the fourth one I forgot to mention is heavy coke fumes from the coke boilers. How we managed to escape asphyxiation underneath, I shall never know. And of course, the stage was an apse, semicircle. And it was years before we discovered that that semicircle was asymmetric and the plans were false. And no wonder they had to keep sawing off a bit corner of the set that they built in the workshops on Sunday every week because, of course, the stage hadn't been measured properly.
Well, you survived. And of course, alongside the theatre, it was an art gallery, wasn't it? Because there were some splendid works of art, weren't they, on each side?
Well, they weren't so splendid the time I got there. Theoretically, the public was supposed to have access at all times, and that included rehearsals. But, of course, that wasn't practical. There were two nice pictures there, the blue coat boy. Otherwise, they were very varnished, thunderstorm over Dedham or whatever it was, and they weren't very nice to look at all.
Now, at interval time, then the movies came on. It was a peculiar sort of electric projection, yes, wasn't it?
Stillwell, Derby and Company used to give you slides. Local advertisers paid for the privilege of having their advertisement thrown onto a screen, which was unrolled down in front of the stage, and they sort of came across like this, and then went across like that, and it was a very curious system, but you made a bit of money out of it. And of course, coffee in the early days was served in the auditorium on a kitchen table covered with oilcloth in chipped mugs from an urn, which was carried down proudly by Fred, by a marvellous woman called Ethel who stood there. And of course, that meant that people took them back to their seats and kicked them over during Act Two, so it wasn't very nice.
When did the concept come for this theatre, the Mercury Theatre? When did you think that we've got to move the theatre on in Colchester?
I was misled before appointment by being told that a new theatre was on the horizon. Though there had been much talk over very many years, there was nothing at all in prospect. Until 1965, when the government published a white paper drafted by Jenny Lee, which gave funding to the Arts Council for buildings for the arts. It made the whole thing possible. And so 66 was the first meetings held with the help of the Theatres Advisory Council, with the Colchester Borough Council. 67, we really got cracking, and there was a trust formed, and then Norman Downey was appointed as an architect, and 69, a fund was raised for building three ways: the public locally, the local authority who also gave the site of land, and the Arts Council of Great Britain. And this building we're sitting in now was begun in 1970 and opened on May the 10th, 1972.
And a very momentous time, because the pantomime closed in the old Rep, and then you moved house.
Yes, we did. On the last night of the pantomime, we had a big party, and everybody cried, and so we sang Auld Lang Syne and the rest of it. And then we moved into here and did a great deal of work. Our own technical people did an immense amount of work getting the place out. A chap called John Coffey, who was our chief electrician, did a great amount of electrics to save money. They're enormously patriotic, because they'd been working under these terrible conditions. And this was a palace. Now, of course, what came to be realised, of course, was what I knew all along, that the backstage, in fact, was hopelessly underhoused. But after the Albert Hall, anything was heaven. And thank goodness, recently, workshops have been added on the back, which we really would have longed to have had from the beginning. But there just wasn't the money, because remember, in those days, nobody had built anything recreational in Colchester much bigger than an extension to the golf club. And the trustees really took their lives in their hands, raising the amount of money they did. And they're extremely cautious. They're under the chairmanship of Lord Allport, who was an absolute trivet right the way through. And of course, we had Bernard Mason as our chairman, so they were a wonderful pair getting us off the ground. So we all of us remain enormously grateful to them forever for all they did to get the place. And remember, it wasn't so easy to get public appeal. If it hadn't been for Harvey Benham and the Essex County newspapers publicising wholeheartedly with Reg Clark, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, the need for a theatre, and raising a campaign where all the great and the good of the locality wrote to the correspondence column and said, we've got to have a new theatre, it wouldn't have happened. So I think without Harvey, we wouldn't be sitting here. I count myself extraordinarily lucky. When I came into the theatre, and I was a late entrant, going to RADA, 9:57, theatres were closing down all over the country. And when I arrived at Colchester, things had got to rock bottom, and they could only go up. And after that Housing the Arts, 1965, over the country, new theatres were built. There was a revival of theatre building. There was a revival in theatre audience who had been wooed away from the television. Along with that was a wonderful crop of new playwrights, new plays. Splendid talent among the actors, designers and technicians. And through the 1970s, 1980s, there was a plateau of more or less adequate subsidies, good attendances, excellent attendances compared with nowadays for theatres throughout the country. And it wasn't until the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, that things began to go down again. One of the reasons is subsidy diminishing in real terms. Maybe it's pattern of audience attendance as well. But this thing I do know, that now there's a bigger crisis as there has been since those times in the 1950s. And I never thought that I'd live to see the day when the Wolsey Theatre in Ipswich would go dark, and the Westcliff Theatre, Palace Theatre, will also go dark. And I congratulate the people running the Mercury here, the board and the people who are doing it, that the Mercury has survived. And let's hope to goodness it goes on surviving and flourishing into the next millennium.
That's an